August 3, 1945. Leyte Island, Philippines. The sun hung like molten iron in a sky bleached white by heat. The air shimmered above the red clay earth, and even the insects seemed to move slowly, as if the very atmosphere had thickened into something viscous and oppressive. In a clearing carved from jungle that had been pushed back but never fully defeated, a group of 42 Japanese women stood in two ragged lines. They wore the remnants of military nursing uniforms, once white, now stained the color of rust and earth and old blood. Their faces, burned dark by months under the tropical sun, were masks of exhaustion and apprehension. Before them stood an American officer, a major with sweat darkening the armpits of his khaki shirt, consulting a clipboard with what appeared to be genuine concentration. Behind him, the prefabricated buildings of a prisoner of war processing center reflected the brutal light like mirrors. The women waited for the orders they knew would come. Orders to dig, to haul, to clean, to perform the backbreaking labor that was the universal currency of the defeated. What they did not expect, what they could not have conceived within the framework of everything they had been taught about duty and sacrifice and the obligations of the vanquished, was for the major to gesture toward a stand of mahogany trees at the edge of the compound, their broad leaves creating pools of shadow on the ground, and say through an interpreter, "You'll work in shifts. 20 minutes on, minutes rest in the shade. We have water stations under every tree. Drink as much as you need." The interpreter, a Nisei soldier from California, repeated the words in Japanese. The women stared. Several glanced at each other with expressions that mingled confusion with disbelief. Rest? Shade? Water? These were not the terms of imprisonment they understood. These were not the wages of defeat they had been prepared to pay. To comprehend the seismic dissonance of that moment requires an excavation of the entire architecture of belief that had shaped these women long before they ever found themselves standing in the Philippine heat as prisoners of the American military. The Japanese Empire, in its conception of war and duty and the relationship between superior and subordinate, had constructed a cosmology so rigid and so all-encompassing that it governed not just action but thought itself. The military nurses of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had volunteered for service, or been conscripted, depending on the year and the desperation of the moment, with a clarity of purpose that was absolute. They would serve. They would endure. They would sacrifice their comfort, their health, and if necessary their lives for the Emperor and the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The concept of personal welfare was not merely secondary, it was irrelevant, almost obscene in its selfishness. These women had been trained in institutions that prized obedience above all else. The military nursing schools of Japan, established in the early decades of the 20th century as the empire modernized its medical corps, had modeled themselves on a fusion of traditional Japanese hierarchical structures and imported Prussian military discipline. A nurse was to be silent, efficient, and utterly subservient to the authority of doctors, officers, and the institutional machine itself. She was to work until she collapsed, and then, if possible, to rise and work again. Comfort was weakness. Rest was indulgence. The ideal nurse was a figure of almost Buddhist self-abnegation, extinguishing her individual needs in service to something larger. And crucially, the nurses had been taught what to expect from the enemy. American propaganda, as understood through the filter of Japanese military indoctrination, painted the Western forces as barbaric, as racially inferior, as men driven by base appetites and cruel instincts. The stories circulated among Japanese military personnel, stories that were part strategic misinformation, part projection of Japan's own wartime brutalities, described Americans as rapists and murderers, as men who would defile Japanese women and laugh at their suffering. The military leadership deliberately cultivated this terror. It served multiple purposes. It stiffened resistance, discouraged surrender, and ensured that those who did fall into enemy hands expected nothing but the worst. Death before dishonor was not merely a slogan, it was policy, psychology, and prophecy all woven together. When the garrisons in the Philippines began to collapse in the grinding campaigns of 1944 and 1945, the nurses found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. Military hospitals, established in the early years of Japanese occupation when victory seemed inevitable, had become charnel houses of neglect as supply lines were severed and resources evaporated. The nurses worked with almost nothing: no anesthesia, no antibiotics, insufficient bandages, inadequate food. They performed amputations with saws meant for carpentry. They stanched bleeding with cloth torn from their own uniforms. They watched young soldiers die of infections that would have been trivial to treat with proper medicine. And through it all, they maintained the discipline of their training, the stoic endurance that was expected, even as their own bodies wasted from malnutrition and disease. The American advance through the Philippines, beginning with the landings at Leyte in October 1944, was methodical and overwhelming. Japanese forces, cut off from resupply and reinforcement, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were already dead. The nurses, stationed at field hospitals and aid stations that were often barely more than tents or caves, found themselves increasingly close to the front lines as those lines collapsed inward. Some nurses died in artillery bombardments. Others were killed when hospitals came under direct attack. Collateral damage in a theater where the lines between combatant and non-combatant had long since blurred into irrelevance. And some, in the final chaotic weeks before the Japanese surrender, found themselves cut off, isolated, and ultimately captured by advancing American units. The capture itself was terrifying. The women, some of whom had armed themselves with grenades or knives with the intention of suicide rather than surrender, found themselves surrounded by American soldiers who approached with weapons raised but expressions that were wary rather than murderous. The soldiers shouted commands that the women did not understand. They gestured, hands up, come forward, slow movements. Some women complied immediately, too exhausted to resist. Others hesitated, torn between the instinct for survival and the years of indoctrination that screamed surrender was the ultimate shame. A few attempted suicide, pulling pins from grenades or raising knives to their own throats, only to be tackled and disarmed by American soldiers who moved with startling speed to prevent the deaths. And then came the processing. The women were searched, a humiliating necessity, conducted with a brusque efficiency that was nonetheless far gentler than they had anticipated. They were not struck. They were not mocked. The soldiers, most of them young men who seemed almost embarrassed by the task, performed the searches and then stepped back, gesturing toward trucks. The nurses climbed into the vehicles in silence, many trembling with fear and exhaustion, waiting for the violence they believed was inevitable. The violence never came. At the processing center on Leyte, the nurses were registered, photographed, and assigned prisoner numbers. They were given medical examinations, a surreal experience, being examined by American doctors and medics who checked for wounds, infections, malnutrition. Several women flinched when the medics approached, expecting blows. The medics noticed, paused, then continued with exaggerated slowness, showing empty hands, speaking in low, calm voices even though the women could not understand the words. One medic, a corporal from Minnesota with red hair and freckles, smiled and gave a thumbs-up gesture to a nurse whose arm he had just bandaged. The nurse stared at him in utter incomprehension. But it was the work detail on that sweltering August morning that truly shattered the framework of expectation. The women had been assigned to help sort and organize medical supplies, a task that made sense, given their background. They were to move crates from a supply truck to a storage building, to unpack and inventory the contents, to arrange everything according to a system that an American sergeant would explain through the interpreter. It was physical labor, but not brutal. It required attention but not specialized skill. Under normal circumstances, it would have been unremarkable. But the circumstances were not normal. And the American approach to the work was so alien to Japanese military culture that it might as well have been a transmission from another planet. The major's instructions, delivered through the interpreter, emphasized safety and health. Work in shifts. Rest in the shade. Drink water frequently, not as a reward but as a requirement. If anyone felt dizzy or ill, they were to stop immediately and report to the medic station. The goal was to complete the work efficiently, but not at the expense of the workers' welfare. Efficiency, the major explained with the earnest conviction of a man who had been trained in modern industrial management principles, was actually enhanced by proper rest and hydration. Exhausted workers made mistakes. Dehydrated workers collapsed. The Army had studied this, had data on it, had written regulations around it. The women listened to the translation with expressions of polite incomprehension. In the Japanese military, The approach to labor was fundamentally different. Work was to be completed regardless of personal cost. If a soldier or a nurse collapsed from exhaustion, that was unfortunate but not a reason to alter the pace or the expectations. The individual was expendable, the task was paramount. To suggest that one should rest, that one should prioritize personal comfort over the completion of duty, was to suggest a form of moral failure. And yet here was the American major, not suggesting but ordering them to rest. The first shift began. 21 women moved to the supply truck and began unloading crates under the supervision of 2 American soldiers. The crates were heavy, filled with bandages and surgical instruments and bottles of medicine. The women worked in silence, moving with the mechanical efficiency of long practice. They formed a line, passing crates from hand to hand, faces set in expressions of concentration. The heat was immense. Within minutes, sweat soaked their clothing. The sun hammered down on the clearing with a physical weight. After 20 minutes, a whistle blew. One of the American soldiers gestured toward the mahogany trees. "Shift change," he called. "Rest break. Go on, get in the shade." The interpreter translated. The women hesitated. This was the moment when orders were supposed to intensify, when the pace was supposed to increase, when rest became something earned only through the completion of impossible quotas. But the American soldiers were not shouting. They were gesturing toward the shade almost encouragingly. The women, moving with uncertain steps, walked to the trees. Under the broad leaves, the temperature dropped perhaps 10 degrees, not cool, but measurably less oppressive. And there, arranged on a wooden table, were metal cups and a large canvas water bag, the kind the Americans call the Lister bag, with multiple spigots. A medic stood beside it, smiling, gesturing toward the cups. One nurse, a woman named Yoshiko who had served in field hospitals from Bataan to Leyte, approached the water bag with the caution of someone approaching a potential trap. She took a cup. The medic nodded, still smiling, and gestured for her to fill it. She opened one of the spigots. Water, cool and clear, splashed into the cup. She drank, tentatively at first, then deeply. The water tasted of metal and canvas, but it was clean and abundant. When she finished, the medic gestured again. "More, drink more." He refilled the cup and drank again. The other women, watching this interaction, began to approach the water station. Within minutes, all 21 of them stood in the shade, drinking water, some of them on their second or third cup. And slowly, almost hesitantly, some of them sat down on the ground. No one stopped them. The American soldiers were loading their own crates now, performing the labor that the Japanese women had been doing, maintaining the flow of work while the prisoners rested. Yoshiko would later describe this moment in testimony recorded by Allied intelligence officers conducting interviews with Japanese POWs. "I did not understand," she said. "In the Japanese army, if you stopped working, you were beaten or punished. If you drank too much water, you were told you were weak, that you were failing in your duty. But the Americans, they wanted us to drink. They wanted us to rest. I thought perhaps they were making us strong only so they could work us harder later. But then the next shift came, and it was the same. 20 minutes work, 20 minutes rest. Always water. Always shade. The pattern repeated through the morning. Work, rest, water, shade. The American soldiers maintained the system with a kind of cheerful efficiency that itself was alien to the Japanese nurses. The Americans joked with each other, called out encouragement, complained about the heat in voices that carry no real distress, only the ritual griping that was the universal language of soldiers everywhere. When one Japanese nurse stumbled while carrying a crate, dropping it and spilling bandages across the ground, she braced herself for punishment, a shout, a blow, some mark of disapproval. Instead, 2 American soldiers hurried over, helped her pick up the bandages, and one of them gave her a pat on the shoulder and a phrase the interpreter translated as, "It's okay, accidents happen." It was this casual kindness, delivered without calculation or apparent effort, that began to corrode the certainty with which the nurses understood the world. They had been taught that the Americans were devils. But devils did not provide shade and water. Devils did not smile and pat shoulders and say, "It's okay." The cognitive dissonance was profound and destabilizing. By midday,
When the work detail broke for lunch, the women had entered a state of psychological vertigo. They were given food, not the thin rice gruel they had subsisted on during the final months of the war, but actual meals: canned beef, vegetables, bread, fruit. The portions were generous, almost incomprehensibly so. Several women ate slowly, carefully, as if still expecting the food to be snatched away. Others ate with a desperation that came from months of near starvation, stuffing food into their mouths until American medics, concerned about refeeding syndrome, gently intervened and explained through the interpreter that they needed to eat slowly, that their bodies needed time to adjust to adequate nutrition again. The food became the symbolic center of their transformation. In Japanese military culture, deprivation was virtue. Soldiers and nurses were expected to endure hunger as a mark of dedication. The stories of Japanese fortitude, tales of soldiers surviving on handfuls of rice, of garrisons enduring months of near starvation without complaint, were celebrated as evidence of superior spirit. The Americans, with their abundant supplies and their seemingly inexhaustible logistics, were viewed as decadent, weakened by their reliance on material comfort. But here, in the prisoner of war camp, the women encountered a different calculus. The Americans had so much food that they could feed their prisoners generously. They had so much water that they could insist their prisoners drink constantly. They had so many supplies that they could prioritize the health and welfare of enemy captives, and this abundance was not presented as a luxury or a gift to be earned. It was presented as a baseline expectation, a right that derived from nothing more than the fact of being human. The contrast with their previous experience was absolute. In the Japanese military hospitals where they had served, the nurses had watched soldiers die of starvation, die of thirst, die of infections that could have been prevented with basic sanitation and adequate nutrition. Resources were scarce, and the scarcity was accepted as inevitable, even noble. But the Americans had resources in quantities that seemed almost fantastical. Where did it all come from? How could they sustain such abundance? And why did they extend it even to prisoners, to enemies? Over the following days and weeks, as the nurses continued their work details, always in shifts, always with rest breaks, always with water and shade, they began to observe and internalize the systems that governed American military operations. There was an obsessive focus on efficiency, but efficiency in service of human welfare. American officers carried manuals, thick books filled with regulations and procedures. There were rules for everything: how long a work shift should last, how much water a person needed in tropical heat, how many calories were required to maintain health, what the signs of heat exhaustion looked like, and what to do when they appeared. The Japanese nurses, trained in a system where an officer's word was law and regulations were often improvised or ignored in favor of traditional hierarchies, found this American bureaucratic rigidity both baffling and strangely comforting. There was a predictability to it. If the manual said workers should rest for 20 minutes every hour, then workers rested for 20 minutes every hour, regardless of whether an officer felt the rules should be bent or broken. The system was larger than any individual within it. Intelligence records from the Allied translator and interpreter section, which debriefed thousands of Japanese POWs during and after the war, contain numerous accounts from prisoners expressing bewilderment at American abundance and American systems of care. One report, dated September 1945, notes, Japanese prisoners consistently express surprise at the quantity and quality of food provided in POW camps. Many state that they are eating better as prisoners than they did as active duty personnel in the IJ. This has a measurable effect on morale and cooperation. Another report, focusing specifically on female prisoners, observes, Japanese nurses and female auxiliaries demonstrate significant psychological adjustment difficulties upon capture, stemming from indoctrination regarding expected treatment by enemy forces. Many arrived expecting execution or sexual violence. The provision of medical care, adequate food, and respectful treatment appears to create cognitive dissonance that, over time, results in fundamental reevaluation of prior beliefs about American forces and, by extension, the validity of IJ propaganda. For Yoshiko and the other nurses in the Leyte camp, this reevaluation was not instantaneous. It unfolded gradually, through accumulated evidence that contradicted their expectations. There was the day when one of the nurses, a woman named Fumiko,
fainted from heat exhaustion despite the rest breaks. She was immediately carried to the medical tent, where an American doctor examined her, provided intravenous fluids, and kept her under observation for 2 days. When she recovered and expected to be punished for failing in her duties, she was instead greeted by the major, who asked through the interpreter if she felt well enough to return to work, or if she needed more rest. She chose more rest, half expecting retribution. None came. There was the day when it rained, a torrential tropical downpour that turned the compound into a sea of mud. The work detail was cancelled. The nurses were told to remain in their barracks, to stay dry, to rest. Through the windows, they watched American soldiers working in the rain, moving supplies under tarps, constructing drainage ditches. The Americans worked while the prisoners rested. The inversion of expectations was complete. There was the day when one of the interpreters, the Nisei soldier from California, sat with a group of nurses during a rest break and answered their hesitant questions. Where did the food come from? America grew vast amounts of food, more than it could consume, and the surplus was shipped to feed soldiers and allies and even prisoners. How could America afford such generosity? Because the American economy was enormous, built on principles of industrial production and efficient distribution that could sustain a war on multiple continents, while maintaining abundance at home. Why did American soldiers treat prisoners well? Because that was the law, the regulation, the expectation of a democracy that held, at least in principle, that all people possessed certain inalienable rights. The interpreter's answers were translations not just of language but of worldview. He was describing a civilization organized around premises that were fundamentally alien to the nurse's experience. Japan had built an empire on hierarchy and scarcity, on the glorification of sacrifice and the acceptance of suffering as the natural order. America, for all its contradictions and hypocrisies, had built a society on the promise of abundance and the ideal, however imperfectly realized, that individuals possess rights independent of their station or their utility to the state. The symbolic power of the shade trees cannot be overstated. In Japanese military culture, shade was for officers. Enlisted men and subordinates worked in the sun. It was a visible marker of rank and privilege. But the Americans provided shade for prisoners, for the lowest of the low in the military hierarchy. They did it not as a special favor but as a matter of routine, as obvious and necessary as providing water or food. The shade was not earned, it was given, and in that giving, in that assumption that even prisoners deserved protection from the brutal sun, was encoded a message about the value of human life and comfort that ran counter to everything the nurses had been taught. As August turned to September and then to October, as the war ended and the camps began the long process of repatriation, the nurses found themselves facing a future that was unimaginable in its uncertainty. Japan had surrendered. The emperor had spoken on the radio, his voice thin and distorted, calling for his people to endure the unendurable and accept the unacceptable. The empire was gone. The certainties that had governed their lives were ashes. Who were they now? What did they believe? Some nurses clung to bitterness. They constructed narratives of victimhood in which they had been betrayed by their leaders, misled by propaganda, caught in circumstances beyond their control. They accepted the material comforts of American captivity but rejected the ideological implications, insisting to themselves and each other that Japanese values were still superior, that American abundance was still decadence in disguise. These women would return to Japan carrying resentment and a determination to forget. Others found themselves in a more liminal space, unable to return to their old beliefs but uncertain what should replace them. They had seen that the Americans were not devils. They had experienced generosity and systematic care and a concern for human welfare that contradicted years of indoctrination. But accepting this meant accepting that they had been lied to, that they had participated in a system built on lies, that the sacrifices they had made and the suffering they had endured had been in service of something rotten. That was a burden almost too heavy to bear, and a very few, began the painful work of genuine transformation. They looked back at their service not with pride but with horror, seeing for the first time the brutalities they had witnessed and accepted as normal. They remembered the prisoners of war who had passed through Japanese military hospitals, the Allied soldiers who had received minimal care or deliberate neglect, who had been treated not as human beings but as enemy objects. They remembered the comfort women, The Chinese and Korean and Filipino girls who had been enslaved to service Japanese troops, whose suffering had been invisible to them or accepted as unfortunate necessity. They remembered, and they began to understand that the shade and water and kindness they had received as prisoners was not the norm of war but a specific choice made by a specific system, and that their own system had made different choices. Yoshiko would be one of these women. In the decades after the war, she would become an advocate for reconciliation and historical honesty. She would speak at schools and universities, describing her experiences as a military nurse and as a prisoner of war. She would talk about the shade trees, about the water stations, about the American major who had insisted that prisoners deserved rest and care. And she would use these memories as a counterpoint to the narrative of Japanese victimhood that dominated much of post-war discourse in her country. Japan, she would argue, needed to confront not just its defeat but its own brutalities, its own failures to extend humanity to those it had conquered. The Americans had shown mercy to their prisoners, Japan had not. That difference mattered. That difference meant something. Her testimony, preserved in archives in Tokyo and Washington, includes a passage that distills the essence of her transformation. Under the mahogany trees on Leyte, drinking water from American canteens, resting in shade that we had been told we did not deserve, I began to understand that I had been lied to about many things. Not just about the Americans, but about the nature of duty, about the purpose of sacrifice, about what it means to be strong. The Japanese military taught us that strength meant endurance without complaint, that we should destroy our bodies in service to the state. But the Americans showed us a different kind of strength, the strength of a society so abundant that it could afford to care for its enemies, so confident that it did not need to be cruel. I am not saying America was perfect. I learned later about its own cruelties, its own hypocrisies. But in that camp, in those August days, what I experienced was a systematic kindness that changed everything I thought I knew. The documentary evidence of the American treatment of Japanese POWs, including female prisoners, reveals a system that was methodical in its implementation of humanitarian standards. The United States had ratified the Geneva Conventions, and the military took those obligations seriously, not out of pure altruism, but out of a pragmatic recognition that humane treatment of prisoners served multiple purposes. It encouraged surrender, reducing American casualties. It provided moral high ground in the propaganda war. It aligned with American self-conception as a nation of laws and rights. And it was, by the standards of total war between nations that hated each other with genuine fervor, the right thing to do. Camp inspection reports from the International Red Cross, which had access to American-run POW facilities throughout the Pacific Theater, consistently note adequate food, clean water, medical care, and adherence to convention standards. The reports also note the surprise and confusion of Japanese prisoners who arrived expecting brutality and found instead a system that, while certainly restrictive and controlled, prioritized their basic welfare. This is not to sanitize the American war effort. The Pacific War was characterized by enormous brutality on all sides. American forces committed atrocities. Japanese American citizens were interned in camps that, while not comparable to German concentration camps, or even to the conditions in which Japan held Allied POWs, were nevertheless profound violations of civil rights. Racism shaped American perceptions and policies in the Pacific Theater in ways that were ugly and indefensible. But in the specific context of POW treatment, the documentary record is clear. The American military system provided care that was, by the standards of the time and the circumstances, remarkably humane. And that care had consequences. It changed minds. It altered perceptions. It planted seeds that would grow, slowly and unevenly, into a post-war relationship between Japan and America that, while complex and often troubled, was built on something other than pure hatred. The nurses who rested under the mahogany trees, who drank from the water stations, who ate the generous rations and received medical care and were called upon to work in shifts designed to protect their health. These women carried those experiences back to Japan. They told their families. They told their friends. They became, in their own small ways, ambassadors of a truth that cut against the grain of wartime propaganda, that the enemy had been capable of mercy. The shade, in the end, was not just protection from the sun. It was a space where transformation could occur, where the certainties of indoctrination could be examined in the cool relief of unexpected kindness. It was a symbol of a society that had built systems to protect human welfare even in the extremity of war, that had written regulations insisting on rest and water and care, that had trained its soldiers to see enemies not as objects to be destroyed but as human beings whose dignity persisted even in defeat. The epilogue to this story unfolds across decades. The nurses returned to a Japan that was itself transformed, occupied and rebuilt, stripped of its empire and forced to confront the ruins of its own ideology. In that reconstruction, the small stories of individual transformation, the memories of shade and water, of kindness from unexpected sources, became part of the larger narrative of Japan's reckoning with its past and its future. Not all Japanese accepted that narrative. Many resisted it, preferring myths of victimhood or justifications of necessity. But for those who had experienced the alternative, who had seen that war did not have to strip away all humanity, who had rested under trees while their captors worked to keep them safe, for them, the memory was indelible. Yoshiko, in her final interview before her death in 1998, returned to the image of the shade trees one last time. "I dream about them sometimes," she said. "Those trees on Leyte, the way the light filtered through the leaves, the taste of the water from the canvas bags. In my dreams, I am young again, and I am resting in that shade, and I am just beginning to understand that the world is larger and stranger and more full of possibility than I had ever been allowed to believe. The Americans gave us shade. It seems like such a small thing. But small things can change everything. And so the story persists, a quiet testament to the transformative power of systematic kindness, of abundance deployed in service of human dignity, of the spaces, literal and metaphorical, where enemies can rest and reconsider and begin the long, uncertain journey toward a more honest understanding of themselves and the world. The shade trees of Leyte, the water stations, the 20-minute rest breaks, these are not monuments. They do not appear in history books. But they changed lives, changed minds, and in doing so, contributed in their modest way to the shape of the peace that followed the war. That is the legacy of the shade, not grand or dramatic, but persistent and real, casting its influence across the years like the shadows of trees that no longer stand but whose memory remains, offering rest to those who carry the weight of a difficult past and an uncertain future. The Japanese nurses who could not believe that Americans let them rest were changed by that rest, changed by the shade, changed by the encounter with a form of strength they had not been taught to recognize. And in their changing, they became living proof of a truth that transcends nations and ideologies, that mercy is not weakness, that abundance enables generosity, and that even in the midst of war, there are choices to be made about what kind of victors we will be and what kind of world we will build. From the ruins,